Welcome, everybody. I think we'll get ourselves going. Welcome to our kickoff meeting of the Tribal and Energy and Climate Exchange, or what we're calling TECX meetings. I am Josh Simmons with Prosper Sustainably, and as Angie mentions, we encourage you. We want this to be an active discussion forum environment, so we encourage you to keep your cameras on if you're comfortable doing so. And I also want to give you a heads up: the meeting's being recorded. And also I'll let Angie take the next steps.
All right, well, hi again, everybody, welcome. You've only gotten probably a couple of emails to just briefly tell you what it is we're here to do together, but we hope this is the first of at least several meetings. The idea behind these meetings is to help California tribes pursue their energy and climate goals by number one here, connecting regularly to exchange knowledge on tribal clean energy and adaptation and resilience topics from the field. We also want to provide an opportunity to learn about and share feedback on opportunities and resources from tribal serving agencies. So folks that are on the line are hopefully mainly tribal representatives, folks that are working within a tribe, but we also have folks from different types of organizations that are tribal serving. And then we also are, because Josh and I are representing the California Tribal Gaps Analysis, a statewide project, we also are going to take the opportunity to encourage your participation in that project to help inform future opportunities. So all of this is around looking for opportunities to help support tribes in California in having an easier time pursuing their energy and climate goals. So I'm just wanting to walk through a quick agenda. First things first is introductions. And one of the things we want to do is just encourage you to, in the chat box, just introduce yourself. We actually have quite a few people on the line today. Won't have time to go through everybody out loud, but if you could provide your name, organization, and location, that would be fantastic. I do have a couple of polls we'll do here in just a minute, just to get a better understanding of who's here with us. And then if you can share your webcam, like I said, that would be great, because we do want this to feel, almost in person or somewhat interactive. And then Josh and I are going to introduce ourselves a bit too, and a little bit around how we got here, why we've begun these conversations, the background, and then which is really around the California Tribal Gaps Analysis, and tell you a little tiny bit about that project before we move into roundtable announcements and discussion, which is just an opportunity to share information between the organizations that are here that might help the purpose, which is supporting tribes that are pursuing their energy and climate goals. Then we're going to move into our featured discussion, which is from the CPUC on Tribal Resiliency Valuation Methodology. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, and then we'll get into some next steps, which gives us an opportunity to talk about how we want to do this moving forward. What kinds of content do we want to work with together, to discuss together in future meetings, and what would that structure look like? So that's on the agenda for today. And I think I'll pass it back over to Josh to give you that background. Actually, sorry, I meant to launch the poll really quickly. So why don't I launch that first poll? Okay, you actually have two questions. And so if you're with us, the first question is, what is the most compelling reason you're participating in the Tribal Energy and Climate Exchange? And so you can decide whether or not it's to connect with tribes, to exchange knowledge, learn about opportunities and resources, or provide feedback and input that can inform future opportunities. And number two, what type of organization do you represent? We just want to get a feel for who's with us on the line today. So we'll give it a minute for folks to be answering those two questions, and then we'll close it and we'll show you the results so you too get a better understanding of who's with us today.
Shasta, you can see the poll, right? I can't for some reason, but
people are responding, so they must.
Yeah, and I just took it, so
perfect.
Yes, it's working.
All right, we need to borrow Shasta's goat. Anybody else out there who would like to answer, that would be wonderful. This is so just our first meeting. We expect to have hopefully higher numbers of participation even in, as we get kicked off here. We want this to be a home for conversations that are actually valuable for California tribes. All right, so I'm going to end the polling and just share with you what we found here. Okay, so it sounds like most folks primarily are here to learn about opportunities and resources, which is great because we will talk about that. And what type of organization do you represent? 56% of the folks that at least responded to the survey are from the California Native American tribes, so great. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and then we'll move on to the background. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Angie. Man, I have, I think, managing about half dozen windows right now. So the Tribal Energy and Climate Exchange is under the umbrella of the California Tribal Gap Analysis. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a project that's being funded by the California Energy Commission and administered by the Strategic Growth Council. Prosper Sustainably is leading the project with our team of partners. You can see all the partners down in the bottom right. With the primary purpose of this project is to identify tribal priorities, needs, and barriers in the areas of clean energy and climate change, adaptation, and resilience. And through the project, we'll be providing recommendations for future state programs, funding, technical assistance, and other resources to address the identified needs. This report, this study is going to be primarily informed and shaped by tribal input. And I'll talk more about the tribal questionnaire in just a moment. But so the Tribal Energy and Climate Exchange relates to this because in identifying the various opportunities that are currently out there or emerging, that's a bit of a baseline for where we're seeking to identify gaps in these areas for tribes to address their needs. And so we're compiling these resources and we want to share them through this forum. We're realizing that there isn't really a forum out there right now that is dedicated to exchanging this information for California tribes. So what are the opportunities? What is the valuable information? What are the resources? What is the funding available for tribes to address their clean energy and climate change and resilience related needs? So we will be sharing this information through a database, at least the funding opportunities through the California Tribal Gap Analysis Project, directly sharing those with those who participate. I also want to mention that we are doing a lot of this work with tribes as well, including under the challenge grant with Paula, Rincon, and San Pasqual. And we're similarly seeking and hearing about various opportunities all the time that various, in particular, California agencies are trying to share resources and funding opportunities with tribes. And even being directly in this space, working on these types of projects, finding that I'm learning about things that I wasn't otherwise aware of almost on a weekly basis. So that's really kind of our primary goal and motivation for this project is to be able to create a forum and a space for us to come together and exchange and share this information. So a quick update, and this is a California Tribal Gap Analysis funded initiative, and so we are wanted to promote that and ensure that you're all aware of the Gap Analysis Project. We are seeking tribal input right now. There is a live questionnaire. We're hoping that as many tribes in California will participate, both federally recognized and those without federal recognition. And participating in the questionnaire will ensure that each of your tribes' needs, priorities, and gaps are captured in this analysis and will inform future state investments. And those that do participate will receive the database of existing funding and other resources that we are developing. The final report for this project is expected to be released in the spring of 2020, 2022. We should have a draft out for tribal feedback by the winter, upcoming winter. So far, we have about, I think, 25 or 30 tribes that have received custom questionnaires. Several have completed theirs. I have about 10 more in the queue for their customized questionnaires to be sent to them. So we'll be closing out the questionnaire at the end of the summer, and we really hope that you and your tribe will participate in this project. So you can sign up by visiting the website, caltribalgapanalysis.org. And there's a form there that you can, at the top of the page, you can click on to fill in, or simply you can just email me your interests and I will email over you a copy of a questionnaire for your tribe to complete.
All right, so there's a lot going on right now in the space that would affect tribes that are trying to pursue these clean energy and climate change goals, and I'm sure you're tracking them as well as you can, and you're probably even overwhelmed by how many there are. And so that's part of what we're hoping to do too. If you've received the email to invite you to this, you'll also see that we are starting to compile active resources and opportunities at the bottom of those emails, which I've copied and pasted here just as an example of what to look for. I know the text is too small to read, but go refer back to the emails that we've been sending where we are updating resources and opportunities for you that are timely. So maybe some of them are funding opportunities or events or some kind of knowledge building activity that might be relevant to you as you're trying to do this work. And to the extent we can support it, great. And I want to open this up for a conversation because we think that you probably know of some things that other tribes could benefit from. And if you're willing to share something that you think others, it could be a lesson that you're learning, it could be an opportunity, a resource. I just want to leave it open for a minute. You can share it verbally out loud. You can put it in the chat. And so if you could just keep your comments to under a minute so we can get on to our other business, that would be great. And there are other ways to share as well. So if you have something that you come across, you're like, tribes need to know about this in California, send it to me at that email address, and I will add it to our weekly emails. So Josh, are you seeing anything come through in terms of announcements? While I'm at it here and waiting for folks to maybe chime in, I will say that we also have a couple of people I want to introduce. So Shasta Gone is actually, you probably know her. She's very active in the climate change space for tribes in California. She's also a subcontractor on the tribal gaps analysis. And I also want to make sure that we say hello to Leah Fisher and Tom Gates. They are from the Strategic Growth Council and California Energy Commission, who are administering the contract for the tribal gaps analysis. So hi, everybody.
Angie, I have an announcement.
Great.
So we've got our Region 9 Tribal EPA conference coming up in October. And of course, energy sustainability and climate change will be big aspects of some of our presentations at the conference. So I will put the email or the website address in the chat. And of course, we want all of our tribal folks to come to that conference, but it's also open to others who are interested. And Region 9 is not just California, it's also Nevada and Arizona, but it's taking place in State Line, Nevada, which is better known as South Lake Tahoe. So definitely a good excuse to come, but we will be watching you to see if you're actually at the conference and not just chilling on the beach at the lake.
You will definitely be chilling in October, I think, though.
That's a good point. And I also just recently learned that Lake Tahoe is like 6,500 feet elevation, which for some reason, when I think about lakes, I just imagine that they're at sea level. And apparently I am extremely wrong.
So there's some other things that you may have seen on the recent emails. There was a recent solicitation for the California Resilience Challenge 2021. Make sure that's on people's radar. So go back, you can see the solicitation for funding there on the email. And there's also an active solicitation for broadband and an active solicitation for coping with drought. So just some key topics that, there's a lot of stuff that falls under the rubric of clean energy, but also, climate change, adaptation, and resilience. That's big, and the opportunities come in different disguises. Sometimes it's emergency management, sometimes it's it could be agriculture. There's a lot of places to look. Tanya looks like she wants to say something.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to raise up an issue that I wanted to make sure folks are familiar with. It might be flying underneath the radar, and I'm having a hard time reading all the tiny print there. But there is right now, Senate Bill 99 is a bill that's going through the legislature for community energy resilience planning. And the intent there is to try and not only get it set up, but that it would fund assistance to communities and tribes for community resilience planning. So if you need to hire engineering, technical feasibility, financial feasibility, consultants, it would allocate some funding, and it asks that the CEC, administer those funds for California communities in order to build shovel-ready projects. So I just wanted to raise the flag on that, still working its way through the legislature, but I know that the sponsors, the Climate Center, I've been working with the Climate Center on that, and they are often looking for letters, calls, and I will put a link to their initiative in the chat. So if folks want to sign up for updates, and then, talk to your legislators and your representatives to make sure that it's on their radar that you want to see that funded. So more resources are coming your way to help organize this kind of work.
Thanks, Tanya. It's nice to see you on here. Anybody else have anything they want to share? Okay, well, just know you can come back to these meetings, and if you are aware of those types of pieces of information, feel free to share that. That would be great. And otherwise, email me in the meantime, and we really appreciate it.
And I'll also point out that at the end of the meeting, and as kind of a regular standing item of the meetings, we're going to ask participants about future topics that they want to discuss. So if there are resources that you are aware of, or there are agencies that potentially have resources, then raise that to us, and we will seek to have them participate in one of these meetings to share more information and discuss what opportunities they may have for tribes. Okay, so now we'll move on to our feature discussion, the California Public Utilities Commission Resiliency Valuation Methodology that is currently in development. And before I introduce our speakers, I want to provide a little bit of kind of background and context for how this topic came to my attention. So the CPUC, well, so I guess with climate change and other impacts on tribal communities increasing, there's a need for better tools for understanding and addressing resiliency needs. And we're talking about PSPS events, wildfires, extreme storms, flooding. It certainly seems like these events, these types of occurrences are happening with greater frequency and having greater and longer impacts on tribes and other communities. So the CPUC is working on developing a resiliency methodology as some tools and guide for tribes and other communities to assess and prioritize resiliency needs, identify and score mitigation measures to address those needs, and also to evaluate the effectiveness of the measures that are implemented after they're implemented to ensure that they are having the intended resiliency impact. So conducting this type of analysis is going to better position a tribe to secure CPUC funding, such as the Microgrid Incentive Program that you may be aware of, and I believe that Roseanne and or Julian will touch upon in their presentation. It's also typically going to better position a tribe to secure funding from other agencies or other organizations to address resiliency needs. So Roseanne Rakovich, and hopefully I pronounced that right. Roseanne, actually, I never attempted. She's a senior regulatory analyst with the CPUC. Her and Julian Enos, and again, Julian, is that right?
Ennis rhymes with tennis.
Ennis, okay. Julian Ennis is a utilities engineer. They are running the resiliency work group meetings. The resiliency work group, microgrids, I think microgrids and resiliency work group, and they'll probably talk more about that. They'll be giving the presentation today. I also want to mention that we're in discussions right now to use and help pilot the methodology that's currently in development for the Paula, Rincon, and San Pasqual Joint Energy, Climate, and Sustainability Communities Planning Projects. That's one of the projects funded under the Strategic Growth Council Challenge Grant. And so, we see this as an opportunity to help these three tribes address needs in these areas as well, and consistent with the type of planning we're seeking to do. So I'm going to turn it over to Roseanne and Julian. And I was going to give Kenneth an opportunity to say a few words, but I do not see him on the line unless he called in, but I don't actually believe so. Unless Kenneth, you're that 808 number, then I'll turn it over to Roseanne. And Roseanne, I'll let you share your screen.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to try to, my function says that I cannot share a screen yet.
You should be able to. I just made you co-host.
Okay. Can you see my screen yet?
Now we can.
Okay, great. So my name is Roseanne Ritkiewicz, and my partner Julian Ennis is going to be speaking to you about a process that we have developed as a meta-analysis of basically a meta process of many of the organizations that are around, including the Department of Energy, IEEE, many of the national labs. They've been doing analysis on how to value resiliency and develop resiliency planning over many years, but it seems like of all the considerations that need to happen, a lot of these organizations have focused on different parts of it. So this is an attempt to pull those analyses and processes together in a sequential methodology that could be replicated and used at any scale. So it could be used at a scale of a small consideration like a campus, or a tribal nation, or even at potentially the level of a county or even an IOU territory. It's a way of thinking through the considerations that need to be taken into account in order to provide resiliency, especially to our most vulnerable populations. So with this, I'll just go over some of the points that, that we are taking into consideration when we develop this methodology, and then we'll talk a little bit about the methodology itself. And I'm managing two screens here, so I apologize for any clunkiness here. The pursuit of resiliency is equally a global and local issue. So equity and resilience go hand in hand, and we can see this in 3 of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals: universal access, resilient infrastructure that's inclusive and sustainable, and building our communities to be inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. We are all only as resilient as our most vulnerable communities. But our vulnerable communities, indeed all of our communities, are becoming more impacted by increasing climate change disruptions, which I'm sure we've all felt. So in terms of resilience, the problem to solve becomes how can we optimize grid investments to maximize resiliency? From our perspective, this is what we can, as regulators, we can affect the electrical infrastructure. But what we're trying to take into account is all of the other pieces that are affected indirectly by that electric infrastructure and system. So in terms of resilience, the problem to solve is how we can affect as regulators is how we can optimize the grid investments. So as we attempt to answer this question, we need to keep certain things into mind. One is that climate disruptions are becoming more extreme. So what used to be high frequency or low frequency, high impact are now becoming more high frequency, high impact events. Equity disparity is absolutely increasing, with the resiliency evaluation being different for those at opposite ends of the equity and wealth spectrum. And there are interdependencies between critical infrastructure systems that we're starting to see that may not have been as obvious in previous times when there weren't as many disruptions. And then there's our decarbonization and electrification goals, which we are attempting to reach in order to be able to minimize the climate changes in general. And it's critical to shift to these decarbonized electrification models, but that's going to take an increase in confidence in electrification. So how do we take this knowledge of potentially impending increase in disruptions, electrical dependencies, and equity disparities in being able to handle or prepare for such disruptions, and then translate that into policy that we can guide us into better being prepared and better being able to recover from disruptions? So what we're looking at is, how do we integrate resiliency into regulation? And we're trying to do that by looking at how we quantify and measure and assess resiliency, but that is also related to, but not the same as, valuing resiliency. So we look at quantifying resilience, or quantifying as putting numbers to the amount of risk reduction available, and valuing is to understand how these numbers actually affect us in terms of human impact. So under the relationship between reliability and resiliency, we consider resiliency to be a subset of reliability, with reliability being a measure of day-to-day operations, while resiliency is concerned with more large-scale disruptions that are not so frequent, or not as, hopefully not day-to-day, but longer in duration, and for the most part cause a greater impact. So there's a balance to be struck between the two, and realizing that it might be possible that dollars spent up front might actually save significant dollars later on in potential losses. Currently, there are certain metrics and methodologies that are available, but these only attend to certain aspects of the problem. So there is an interruption cost estimator that many utilities have used in the past that indicates customer willingness to pay, but that survey, that tool has been based on surveys of 2012, which do not reflect people's customers' willingness to pay now that they have experienced large long-term durations. It also only reflects duration outages of less than 24 hours, and now people have experienced longer-term durations. This is also not reflective of those communities that may have been experiencing a lower level of reliability in the first place and have experienced higher levels of outages, even with those lower level of reliabilities. So this estimator is in the process of being updated, but has not been updated yet. There are other tools that utilities have used, such as value of lost load, and these are also based on surveys, but still only are reflecting the more recent PSPS seasons, like that season from 2018, and so haven't been reflecting this rapid increase in our impact of disruptions. Some of the other metrics that are available use a different level of heat maps for hazards, and these incorporate all hazards that might affect reliability or create impacts. And what we're trying to do is take that all hazards framework and embed that in this look at what resilience really looks at, because while currently wildfire is the impact that we're looking at that's most affecting California immediately, there are other hazards that we are susceptible to, especially as climate change increases, such as floods, sea rise, high heat events, and these are not reflected necessarily in current looks at when we're looking at wildfire mitigation plans. I'm going to turn my the talk over to Julian to discuss the difference between, so that we can really get a sense of what's the difference between reliability and how we measure reliability, and how that differs from resilience, and why we can't just take reliability metrics and use those as metrics to understand the resilience impact. Julian?
Great, thank you so much, Roseanne. As Roseanne said, my name is Julian Ennis. I'm a utilities engineer with the Resiliency and Microgrids team, and I've been assisting Roseanne with really building out this 4-pillar methodology for this value of resiliency part of our discussion. But I also oversee the collection and reporting of reliability metrics of the California utilities, which is what I'm going to talk about today a little bit. So I'll give a sort of brief overview of what reliability metrics are, what they measure, and why, like Roseanne said, they're not direct analogs for our discussion of resiliency, but what they can tell us about what the system is doing. So apologies in advance, there's going to be a lot of acronyms in this particular presentation, and I will do my best to spell out what they mean. But this is a lot of new information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask, and I can clarify. So electric system reliability metrics are defined by an IEEE standard. That's 1366. Basically, it lays out the mathematical and statistical definitions for how we define electric system reliability. And this is a standard by which electric utilities across the United States measure and report their own system reliability at both a transmission and distribution level. So the 4 main metrics that we're looking at are the system average interruption duration index, or interruption duration index, sorry, that's SAIDI, the system average interruption frequency index, that's SAIFI, the customer average interruption duration index, which is CAIDI, and the momentary average interruption frequency index, which is MAFI. Next slide, please. This is just sort of a definition in words of what each of these represent, but quickly, the system average interruption duration index measures how many minutes of interruption a customer experienced in a given reporting period, usually a year. The system average interruption frequency index measures the number of interruptions that the average customer within a given area experienced over that same reporting period. Again, these are generally reported yearly for the California utilities. The customer average interruption duration index measures effectively when the power goes out, how long an average customer can expect the power to go out based on that year of outage data. And then the momentary average interruption frequency index, or MAFI, measures how many momentary interruptions, or in this case, interruptions that are less than 5 minutes, that a customer will experience in the course of the year. Next slide, please. Great. So reliability indices are generally reported in 2 ways. They can both include and exclude major event days. A major event day is a statistical classification that looks at the daily system average interruption duration index for the last 5 years and defines a threshold above which an event is considered a major event day. The way that the definition is set up means that only the top 0.63% of events in terms of that daily system average interruption duration index are reported. And generally for regular service, utilities will use these metrics excluding or without the major event days to understand how the system is performing on a day-to-day basis, and make sure they're not sort of chasing these low frequency, high impact events with expensive mitigation measures. So just a couple of notes about this. The definition of the major event day does not account for causality. So anything from an earthquake, a storm, a public safety power shutoff can be considered a major event day only when the electrical outage numbers exceed that statistical threshold set by the previous 5 years of data. So these reliability indices are generally used to motivate investment decisions that will improve reliability. So using the reliability indices without these major event days utility is focusing on how they can improve their day-to-day reliability of the system, whereas with the inclusion of major event days, they can see how significant events that are generally out of the utility's control can dramatically impact the customer experience. Next slide, please. So again, this is a statistical representation of data. So this is just illustrative of the issue that we face in looking at this data, particularly in California. So looking at PG&E's entire service territory, which these metrics here represent, this represents thousands of miles of infrastructure across a very diverse set of terrain, set of electrical infrastructure. And so you can see that, with the inclusion of major event days, you can see that impact of those high frequency events. But you can also see that within that, this statistical definition can obscure regional variation. So if you look at the System Average Interruption Duration Index for the best performing division, San Francisco, it is drastically smaller than the System Average Interruption Duration Index for the worst performing division, which in this case is Humboldt. And with the inclusion of major event days, represents almost 5 days worth of outage, power outage per year. Next slide, please. So these are just a few points that we're internally trying to improve on within this reliability reporting framework. So currently the utilities submit a report every year that has a very detailed list of division performances and other reliability performance based on the governing decision that was 160108, which is linked here in the presentation. And we're attempting to improve the provision of this data through more granular provision of data, GIS formats, and being able to separate out outage types. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about reliability, it's very much, as Roseanne said and quoted in that Sandia report, this is very much a system level measure, insofar as it just measures how long the power was out. This isn't taking into account the impacts of that power being out. So basically we're trying to average over the entire system to try and see what the performance is. Also, another issue with this is that the system planning tends to exclude major event day classifications. Again, this was to avoid chasing these low probability events with expensive upgrades. It's excluding a lot of these large scale disruptive events that when thinking about resiliency investments, those are the things that those are focused on mitigating. However, one thing that this helps sort of gain insight to is that we can look at customer experience, including major event days, which can at least give us an insight into the customer impact for these particular events. And we can also see the frequency for each of those customers to better understand what types of outages and what durations of outages are being experienced. Next slide, please. So just to sort of wrap this all up, the resiliency reflected within these reliability indices, we can basically from the reporting of these indices, we can pull out a data set that's reflective of system-wide sort of historical duration of frequency of outage experienced by the electric ratepayer. And we can use this as sort of a baseline to assess certain resiliency measures across. So if you look at the graph on the right and you see the red line, you can think of this as the baseline case. These reliability indices are basically reporting that the power is out for a certain amount of time. So that is all your load, all of the load that is being served, not being served during that given time. However, within building out mitigation measures within these geographically defined areas can give us these sort of more trapezoidal shaped load cases where we're powering a certain amount of that, and you can compare how much lost load there is against this baseline case to understand that particular improvement. Again, we're trying to build a scalable methodology here, so this is the kind of thing that would require a very granular understanding of what sort of the reliability is doing within a given area, but it at least can form sort of a baseline idea of how much we can be improving and be used in conjunction with a tool like the interruption cost estimator to better understand what the costs are to folks that are experiencing this level of reliability. So with that, I will turn it back over to Roseanne to continue the discussion.
Thanks, Julian. So we have to find ways to measure the difference between that baseline case and the floor when it drops to the x-axis, and the improvements, or the floor when it drops in terms of outages. And the rest of this presentation is about basically how do we do that? How do we find ways to measure that so that we understand when we are asked what the value of resiliency is, we can start to understand what that difference is and be able to potentially quantify that. It's a bit of an impossible task, but we can start to look at different system function relationships in order to understand that. We know we can measure, as Julian was mentioning, how much energy has been lost by looking at those reliability figures with major event day figures involved. We look at that through metrics that indicate that are measured in units of megawatts per hour, and numbers of lines or circuits that were tripped. But there are also interdependent system functions that are also affected, such as water, wastewater, gas, communications, transportation. And then there's these other less easily measured functions that we all know are affected when the power goes out. Those might be economic system functions, social equity system functions, like how many critical facilities might be down, or how many vulnerable or disadvantaged people are affected, and what impact that has on their day-to-day functionality. And there may also be some environmental system functions that are affected by power outages, such as if the power goes out and a whole bunch of people or commercial industries start to fire up their diesel gas generators, what kind of impact does that have on our local area, air pollutants and GHG emissions? So again, this is understand this. What I'm trying to do is introduce a picture of what happens when we have that impact, and develop a common language that we can start to refer to. So that's why I'm going to continue to kind of refer to this trapezoid as a reference point to what happens when we have impacts, so that we can start to understand how we can measure and at least understand those impacts beyond just the energy system. Sorry, my system is slowing down a little bit here. And what I mean by this is something that looks like this. So these systems can be related to each other by time. And by that, I mean, this is an example in the blue layer. This is the example of the energy outage that has happened. And the energy might have been out just for 2 days. But if a family that may have a small amount of income in the first place, and whose job is affected by that energy output, and their ability to maintain or gather ice, or ability to maintain their food in the refrigerator may be impacted directly by that outage, and over 2 days, they may lose an entire refrigerator, which if they've just filled it at the beginning of the month, has a direct and fairly large impact on both their food supply for the rest of the month, as well as the income. The food supply here is reflected in the yellow layer. This was reflected as they lost all of their food after 24 hours with no refrigeration. They were able to purchase a little bit back. They then used food banks in order to gain a little bit more. By the middle of the month, they may have had another paycheck so they could buy a little bit more, but they still never really were able to regain the amount that they lost in the first place. And then at the end of the month, they had another outage, and this time for 5 days. And so again, their food supply was impacted. And the green layer is displaying their income loss. So if they were not able to work, their income dropped significantly. That income never comes back. And then again, they lose their income again for the 5 days at the end of the month. And so although the energy system has recovered seemingly to the pre-impact level, both in the first and second instances, these other related systems are the systems that we're trying to pay attention to and understand and quantify as well as we can, so that we can also quantify improvements in those systems as we improve the systems that affect the infrastructure that affects the energy loss in the first place. I want to stop here for a second and ask if there are any questions. And after this, I'm going to move on to actually discussing what we have come up with as a way to sort of think through resiliency planning that we can start to consider.
So Roseanne, I did see a few questions. I just want to give you a heads up too. We want to stop at 11:55 to be able to kind of wrap up and
Okay.
talk about future topics. So there's not too much time left.
Want to wait for question and answers afterwards?
Yeah, why don't you just try to talk about the methodology, and then hopefully there'll still be a few minutes to, there's 3 questions right now in the chat box.
Okay, that sounds great. So in the methodology, what we're trying to do is basically take each of these details that take into account all of these different aspects that we just talked about. So the methodology basically has 4 pillars. One is a baseline assessment, which is where what we're looking at is, what do we want to protect? Who do we want to protect? And where is it? Where are they? What threatens those things, those assets or people that we want to protect? And how well are we doing currently to protect it? The second pillar is about mitigation measure assessment. So what protection options do we have to improve our current level of protection of those things that we want to protect? What are maybe some options that do the best job at protecting the most? And what do those options cost, so that we can make our decision-making framework can be looked at from the perspective of what kind of hazards threaten things, what does the best job at protecting our assets from the most hazards possible. And then our resiliency scorecard looks at the resiliency configurations that might go into making those those mitigation measures happen. In other words, a 4-hour battery might be not GHG emitting, but it only provides backup for 4 hours, whereas a diesel generator might be able to provide more indefinite long-term duration backup power, but it also has the problem of emitting GHGs and increasing local area pollutants. So while both of them provide backup power and may increase our resilience, there is room for improvement on both ends, and that's what the resiliency scorecard is intended to address, or at least highlight. Our resiliency response assessment is to look back at post-disruption. How well did any investments that we make do in order to actually improve our ability to protect what we want? So that's a real quick understanding of what these pillars look like. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the details of what these look like. And then as time allows, we can go into the details further if we'd like to. In the baseline assessment, we would be looking at defining a geographical area of study, understanding and defining what load tiers or consequence categories we want to protect. In other words, within this geographical area of study, are there critical loads that above all, we really want to make sure that we protect? Are there other loads that we'd like to protect, but maybe if we have very little resources to put to, they are second priority? And then what are discretionaries? Those loads that if we have extra ability to provide support to, that'd be great. But if we have to curtail, then we would put them into the discretionary area.
Roseanne, I actually might just step in because I think we're going to run out of time, and I think that some of the questions might I think they provide a good job at the 4 pillars overall, and if you go further into them, we won't have any time for kind of addressing any of the questions that are raised so far. So I can start off. Laura, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? And actually, Roseanne, if you can keep the methodology up that slide, that might be helpful, just so people have the high level. So Lori's question, oh, I lost it somehow. Angie, do you have it in front of you?
Yes, I do. How do you plan to obtain this data for tribal nations not on the public utility grid? Would this analysis be on a smaller than census code basis? And what would be the downside in participating in this or in sharing data?
So one of the things about this, this methodology is that it's for anybody to use. The decision-making body is it's up to the body that decides to use this framework. So if a tribal council decides that they want to apply this, it would be the tribal council that decides what geography are we looking at, what are our critical facilities that we want to protect, what do we want to be able to apply to, what kind of costs and priorities do we want to assign to it. So it's not necessarily us that's applying this. It could be if the CPUC decides that it's something that we want to be able to put towards a statewide policy, or in certain particular, maybe potentially pilot applications to see how well this actually works. But as an overall methodology, it's usable by anyone. So this data could be accessed by your tribal council. And the thing is that in developing your resiliency projects, you probably already use a lot of these these considerations. This just puts it into more of a formal sequential methodology so that you can kind of check to see, have you missed anything? So in terms of accessing the data is whatever's available to you, to the board or the decision-making body that's using this framework. So if the CPUC were to use it, we would try to access as well as we can, as granular as we can, data that is available on maybe the CalEnviro data, California Healthy Places data, utility circuit data, and other levels of data that are available. Although it wouldn't be the CPUC that's actually doing that, it would probably be a collaborative effort between local governments, tribal governments, and the IOUs. If a tribal council was to be using it, you might be looking at data that's available by way of your tribal census or your tribal data frames or data sets that are available to you, which might actually be formal or informal. That includes things like, what do we want to protect? Well, we know that the high school is being used for our evacuation center and our cooling center, so that's going to be critical for us. And we know that the gas station down the street isn't very accessible to many of the populations, but the gas station across town is actually used by a lot of people. That kind of data collecting and consideration is what might go into this on a smaller scale level. I'm hoping that answers your question. Please let me know if it doesn't.
Lori's not able to talk. She said a follow-up comment that Cal Enviro Screen doesn't work for tribes in general. I think, you know,
Right.
it probably relates to Angie's questions. Angie, you had asked how can tribes access their energy reliability data to support their vulnerability assessments? And Angie, is that just kind of across the board? I mean, you're not talking with respect to this tool, but just in general, want to know that. And then also, is this connected with OPR's resilience metrics process?
That's a good question. We are actually going to be working with OPR. I've got a meeting set up with them this week and next to discuss what resilience metrics they are looking at tracking. And in terms of the ability for the tribes to access like circuit level data, we do have a local government and tribal data portal that the CPUC authorized in our track 1 of this proceeding. I'll let Julian talk to that because he's lead on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the data portals are going to be including a lot of information, including electrical infrastructure, high fire threat districts, and a few other things will be accessible by both local and tribal governments in order to support their resiliency planning processes. Right now, we're working on trying to integrate the reliability data provision into that, but as of right now, there's not a decision governing that. However, the 6 utilities that the CPUC requires to annually report reliability data all have processes by which individual folks can request reliability data for their particular address or circuit that the utilities are required to respond to within 30 days, and access to that data will hopefully be useful to supporting those vulnerability assessments. But those you do have to work with the utilities to do. However, I'm happy to provide information to expedite that or to better understand that process if that would be helpful.
Julian, if there's a link even to how to access it, that would be great if you can drop that in the chat. Lots of people would benefit from that. And I feel like in the interest of time, reliability data sounds like something that could come to tribes, and for the resiliency, it sounds like you need information from them so you get it right? You're looking for communities to inform these metrics so that you are measuring the right stuff, which we don't have time to do today. So in what ways would you like to do you plan to grab additional input from tribes?
Roseanne, I'll defer to you on that one while I find the reliability links.
Sorry, my screen had disappeared, so I couldn't unmute myself. What we're looking for is to understand whether this sort of methodology might work for the tribes, whether there are other resiliency considerations that we should be aware of from the tribe's perspective as we start to look at developing policy that's at a statewide level. We do want to take into account tribal experience and knowledge with developing resiliency plans, and things such as the Cal Enviro screen doesn't work for tribes. That kind of information is important to us. I have heard that before, and so to give us feedback as to what kind of metrics that might be available that would better reflect your experiences would be really helpful to us.
Okay. Thank you guys. We all really appreciate your time. I think what we need to do is kind of think on how we might be able to collect any of that input, or just talk to you briefly afterwards and kind of figure out how you might be able to engage tribes again to get more detailed information. We hope that was useful for folks on the line. We do hope that you will take a moment before we log off today. If you haven't yet, please do sign up for the questionnaire, the Ctga Questionnaire. This is just an example of the kinds of information that we want to know more about. What do tribes need, and how can we get all of these things right? How can we get the opportunities and things that are trying to support tribes in this area right? The discussion, we probably don't have a lot of time for today, but we do have our next meeting, which will be August 10th from 10 to 11, where we're going to have a different topic, and that's going to be from the CEC's EPIC program. EPIC program is a grant opportunity program, and they're going to talk about specific opportunities for tribes. So we do hope you'll join us for that. And in the meantime, there's another event on the 27th, July 27th, and that will be for with folks from the California Climate Initiative, and that is another major source of California funding for climate initiatives. We're going to talk about funding for tribal governments. So we hope you join us for those, and join us next time when we come back together. If you have feedback for us, you can contact Josh Simmons directly, jsimmons@prospersustainably.com.
Yeah, and I'll just mention one last thing is that we have our next meeting on August 10th from 10 to 11, and we'll be focusing on the California Energy Commission's EPIC program opportunities, particularly funding opportunities, past, current, and future for tribal governments. So we'll follow up with an email too with more information. A few questions weren't asked, so we'll try to include some of that and that information we received here in a follow-up. So thanks everybody for participating. Thank you, Roseanne, Julian, for presenting that useful information. And we look forward to seeing you all on August 10th and perhaps on July 27th, the CCI webinar. Thanks everybody.